I knew something was off the second I saw the tire tracks on my ranch road. Deep, fresh, and definitely not from my truck. I live out here in Edgewood, Texas, 10 acres of peace, cattle, and solitude. Or, it was peaceful until Clarissa Goldwyn and her Homeowner Association decided they had some kind of jurisdiction over my land. My name's Dalton Sawyer. I'm a retired firefighter, not a guy who likes drama. But when you mess with my property, we've got a problem. It started 3 weeks ago when Clarissa, a bleach blonde, 50-something tyrant with a clipboard permanently glued to her hand, showed up at my gate. "You're in violation of Community Code 12B, she said, standing on the other side of my fence like she owned the place. I leaned on the fence post. "I'm not part of your HOA. This is private ranch land. Always has been." Clarissa's eyes narrowed. "Actually, our records show this land falls under our expanded jurisdiction. You'll need to remove that shed you built. It's an eyesore." "That shed?" "I built it with my own hands last fall to store feed, tools, and my late father's old workbench. There was no way I was tearing it down." I told her as much. "You set foot on my property again, you'll be trespassing." She gave me this little laugh like I was just some hick who didn't know how things worked. "I'll give you a week to comply." I figured that'd be the end of it. But Clarissa wasn't bluffing. Yesterday morning, I came back from the feed store and found the gate wide open. My stomach dropped. Tire marks snaked up the driveway, and when I rounded the corner, the shed was in pieces. Wood splintered. Tools scattered. The lock to the feed bin broken. Someone had used a chainsaw. There were fresh cuts right through the beams. I checked my cameras. Sure enough, there she was. Clarissa, in broad daylight, strutting onto my land with 2 of her HOA toadies, tearing the place apart like they had every right. I called the sheriff, but he said it was a civil matter unless I could prove she didn't own or control the land. That's when things got personal. You see, I knew I wasn't part of any HOA. This land's been in my family for over 50 years, and I had the original deed tucked in a fireproof box in my den. But something wasn't adding up. Clarissa had been waving around some updated plat that claimed my property was annexed into their master plan. So I started digging. I went to the county recorder's office and pulled every map, deed, and zoning document I could find. There it was, plain as day. My parcel had never been annexed. The HOA's claim? Completely fabricated. But here's the kicker, I found something even better. Clarissa's updated plat? It was filed only 6 months ago, handwritten, poorly scanned, and signed by someone who wasn't a registered surveyor. Forged. I cross-referenced the signature with the county's directory. No such person existed. Clarissa had created a fake deed to rope my land into her HOA and use it to control more territory. I wasn't just going to expose her. I was going to burn down her whole house of cards. I parked my truck behind the county courthouse, clutching the folder tight enough to crumple the corners. The evidence I'd gathered over the past 2 days was ironclad. A forged plat map, falsified annexation papers, and a signature from a non-existent surveyor. Clarissa Goldwyn had not only trespassed, she'd committed felony-level fraud. Inside, the county clerk, Marla, adjusted her glasses and gave me a wary look as I laid the documents across her desk. "This is what she submitted to justify the HOA's expansion," I said, pointing to the forged plat. "And here's the original deed to my property, recorded in 1972, which shows no such annexation ever occurred." Marla flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from polite neutrality to something closer to alarm. "Dalton, this signature isn't in our database. And the seal? It's not registered with the Texas Board of Professional Land Surveying." "I double-checked that myself," I said. "The guy she claimed drew up this map doesn't exist. She made him up to fabricate authority over land she doesn't own." Marla picked up the phone without another word and called in the county attorney. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a backroom office while Assistant District Attorney Raylene Torres reviewed every page under a desk lamp. "Where did you say you got this copy of the plat she filed?" Raylene asked. "Public records. It was scanned into the database 6 months ago," I said. I printed it out 2 days ago to compare it to my deed. She nodded slowly. This isn't just a civil issue anymore. If this is forged, and she used it to claim jurisdiction over your land and destroy private property, she's looking at criminal charges. That was all I needed to hear. Raylene handed the documents off to an investigator in her office, and within an hour, a formal complaint was filed with the sheriff's department. I was told to sit tight while they reviewed everything, but I had no intention of waiting quietly. Back home, I installed 2 more trail cameras, one near the gate, the other facing the back pasture. I also set up a motion alarm near the barn just in case Clarissa or her HOA flunkies thought they could sneak back for round 2. The next morning, I took a drive through the nearby subdivision where Clarissa reigned like a queen. Her house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, flanked by 2 perfectly trimmed boxwoods and a wrought iron sign that read HOA President. I parked on a public road outside the subdivision's boundary and walked up to the first house on the corner. A man in his 40s was raking leaves near the driveway. "You live in the HOA?" I asked. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Unfortunately, I'm Dalton Sawyer. I own the ranch at the edge of the development. Clarissa destroyed my shed last week. She claimed my land was part of the HOA." The man's shoulders tensed. "She said that?" "She's been going around saying she's expanding the HOA. Told us she got permission from the county to annex more parcels. Said it would protect property values." "She lied," I said. "And I've got the proof." He paused, then stuck out his hand. "Name's Rick. She fined me last month for having a camper in my own driveway. My wife's a nurse and we use it for short naps between shifts. Clarissa told me it violated aesthetic standards. I handed him a copy of the report I'd prepared complete with the forged plat and the real property map. "Show this to your neighbors. Let them know what she's been pulling. I'm taking this to court, but the more people who speak up, the better." Rick nodded, already flipping through the pages like he'd just been handed a treasure map. "You're not the only one who's been waiting for a reason to take her down." That night, I got a call from Raylene. "We've confirmed the signature is fraudulent. We're issuing a warrant for Clarissa Goldwyn for filing false public records and criminal trespass." "Good," I said. "She's been getting away with this for too long." "And Dalton," she added, "we've also discovered that this isn't her first time submitting questionable documents. We're reopening an investigation from 2 years ago involving another property dispute." The next day, deputies showed up at Clarissa's house with a search warrant. I didn't need to be there, but I parked down the street anyway, watching from a distance as they carried box after box of files and laptops out of her 2-story fortress. She came out screaming, of course, waving her arms, demanding to speak to the county commissioner, and threatening lawsuits left and right. But none of it mattered. The handcuffs went on, and she was loaded into the back of the cruiser before she could finish her tirade. I turned around and walked back to my truck, not saying a word. A week later, I was called to testify at a preliminary hearing. I brought every document, every timestamp from my trail cams, and even a printed list of the HOA's bylaws, none of which gave them any authority beyond their original boundaries. Clarissa's attorney tried to argue she'd been misled by a third-party consultant, but Raylene shredded that defense in minutes. "The consultant doesn't exist," she said, holding up a certified letter from the Texas Board of Surveying. "And Ms. Goldwyn personally filed the forged plat under oath. This wasn't a clerical error, it was a scheme." The judge didn't hesitate. Clarissa was denied bail due to the ongoing investigation and the possibility of additional charges. The courtroom was packed. Several residents from the HOA had shown up, many of them with copies of the report I'd given Rick. One by one, they started coming forward, filing their own complaints. Clarissa had been inflating fines, issuing citations for imaginary violations, and using fear to keep the neighborhood silent. But now the dam had broken. With her arrest and the fraudulent plat formally revoked, the county issued an emergency injunction dissolving her HOA's current leadership. A temporary oversight committee was established made up of actual residents this time, and they voted unanimously to remove every bylaw Clarissa had added in the past 5 years. I didn't go around bragging. That's not my style. But I did get a letter from the new committee thanking me for what they called restoring integrity to our community. I framed it and hung it in the rebuilt shed, right above my dad's old workbench. And just for good measure, I put up a new sign at the gate: private property, not for sale, not for annexation, not your HO. 2 weeks after Clarissa's arrest, the county's interim oversight committee contacted me. They asked if I'd be willing to walk them through the property lines and explain how she had manipulated the old zoning records. These weren't bureaucrats, they were residents. Regular folks who'd lived under her thumb and were now looking to rebuild something worth keeping. I agreed, but I set one condition. We meet on neutral ground, not at my ranch and not in the HOA clubhouse she used like a throne room. We met at the local VFW, where the walls were lined with flags and plaques, and no one had authority over anyone else. Ken Mahoney, a retired electrician, leaned over the table and pointed at a parcel boundary printout. She used this to justify expanding the HOA last summer. Said the county had reclassified the outer properties, including yours, as adjacent for administrative purposes. That phrase doesn't exist in zoning law, I said. She made it up. Counties rezone, but they don't retroactively assign private land to HOAs. And certainly not without owner consent or a court order. Marcia Tennyson, a soft-spoken woman who ran the weekend farmers market, tapped her pen against the document. She threatened to fine me $500 a day because I had a banner advertising my honey stands. Said it violated external commerce restrictions. I looked for that clause. It doesn't exist. She created whole sections of bylaws without a vote, Ken muttered. And she always claimed the board approved them in closed session. She was the board, I said. The other members were just names on paper. I checked. 2 of them moved away years ago. One's apparently dead. That got their attention. I slid a folder across the table. She forged a quorum, filed meeting notes with fake names. You've got at least 1 count of filing false board minutes, which is a state-level violation under nonprofit governance law. Marcia sat back, stunned. She always said we had no right to question the board's decisions since we weren't active participants. She made us feel like we were just renters on our own land. She didn't just break rules, I said. She used them like weapons. That night, I returned home to find a handwritten envelope wedged into my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a folded sheet of printer paper with a single sentence: "You should have kept your mouth shut." I stood there on my porch, holding it under the floodlight. Wind rustled through the cedar trees and coyotes yipped out in the distance, but the house was otherwise silent. Too silent. I checked both cameras. Nothing unusual. But I wasn't about to wait for another surprise visit. I drove to the sheriff's department the next morning and handed the note to Deputy Langston, who'd been assigned to Clarissa's case. He read it once, then again, holding it up to the light. "It's printed, but the envelope was handwritten," he said. "That narrows it a bit." "I don't care how narrow it is," I said. "She's not supposed to be in contact with anyone involved in the case. If this came from someone on her behalf, we've got a violation." Langston nodded. "Let me run the handwriting against her intake forms. If it matches, you'll hear from us." I didn't wait to hear. I called up an old friend, Darnell, former military police turned private security tech. He came out that afternoon and helped me install a motion-triggered light array and a new license plate camera at the end of my driveway. Nothing says "stay off my land" like 30 feet of LED glare and a live upload to the cloud. And just in time, because 3 days later, that camera caught a black SUV pulling up just after midnight. A man in a fleece jacket got out, walked up to the gate, and took photos of my house before driving off. The plate came back to a company registered under the name Goldwyn Holdings LLC. I brought the footage to Raylene, who had already added 2 new charges to Clarissa's case: conspiracy to defraud and misuse of nonprofit funds. She watched the video silently, then leaned forward. "That LLC? It's not just a shell company. Clarissa used it to funnel HOA funds to herself. Labeled it as consulting and property research. We're up to felony embezzlement now." "She's doing this from jail?" I asked. "She's not in jail," Raylene said. "She made bail 2 days ago. Posted it through a private bond agent in Dallas. She's under house arrest, But that doesn't mean she's alone. I could feel the heat rising behind my ears. So now she's sending people to intimidate me? We'll file a restraining order today, Raylene said. And I'm making a motion to revoke bail. It worked. Clarissa was ordered back into custody pending trial. Her attorney tried to argue she had no knowledge of the SUV visit, but the judge wasn't buying it, especially not after the financial reports came in. Turns out Goldwyn Holdings had been siphoning HOA dues for nearly 6 years, tens of thousands of dollars for land surveys, legal reviews, and development consulting. All of it billed to her own company with no actual services rendered. But the most damning piece came from a resident named Ellie Garrison, who brought in a recording from a board meeting Clarissa had held in her living room last year. In the recording, Clarissa could be heard saying, "They won't know the difference. If we call it a special allocation, they'll pay it without blinking." No one reads the fine print. Ellie handed the USB drive to the oversight committee, who turned it over to the DA. That was the final nail. Clarissa was indicted on 9 criminal counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and destruction of private property. Her lawyer quit mid-case. Her bond was revoked, and the state attorney general's office stepped in to initiate proceedings to dissolve the HOA entirely. At the final hearing, I sat in the back row of the courtroom. Clarissa was in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed to the table. Her hair, once meticulously styled, was limp and gray at the roots. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. When the judge read the decision, you could feel the air shift. The court finds that the Goldwyn Meadows Homeowners Association, as currently constituted, is the product of fraudulent governance and illegal annexation practices. The association is hereby dissolved, its charter revoked, and its remaining funds placed in a restitution account for affected residents. Clarissa Goldwyn will stand trial for the charges as scheduled. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. I kept walking. Back home, my pasture was quiet again. The cattle grazed undisturbed. The new shed stood solid and clean. And on the gate, beneath the sign I'd put up after the first confrontation, I added a second one: no tyrants. No frauds. No exceptions. The fake deed was gone. The HOA was dismantled. Clarissa was awaiting sentencing. And the land? It was still mine, just like it always had been. The morning after the dissolution order, I walked the perimeter of my property with a clipboard and a fresh survey map I'd requested from the county's engineering office. It was mostly for my own peace of mind. The new oversight committee had offered to help reimburse some of the damage Clarissa caused, but I wasn't looking for favors. I just needed to know every inch of my land was secure and documented, this time in a way no one could manipulate. Halfway through the southern fence line, I saw the rusting tailgate of a pickup wedged halfway into a drainage ditch. It wasn't mine, and it hadn't been there last week. A man stood next to it, kicking at the tire like he expected it to roll free on its own. "Need a hand?" I called out. He straightened, startled, then waved sheepishly. "Sorry, didn't mean to cross over your fence line. I was trying to turn around and caught the ditch." I studied him for a beat. He looked about my age, maybe a few years younger, with a county utility badge clipped to his belt. His ID read Eric Baines, Infrastructure Liaison. "You're not the first to get stuck there," I said, stepping closer. "That culvert's been a mess since the last storm." "You on duty?" "Yeah. Temporary assignment. We're doing inspections along the rural corridors now that the HOA's dissolved." Turns out Clarissa had been blocking county maintenance from accessing the utility easements. I raised an eyebrow. She what? She filed private property claims across the back lots. Said the HOA was handling maintenance internally. We found 3 blocked access points, 2 buried junction boxes, and a culvert she covered with decorative rocks. "That one backed up into your neighbor's field last spring." I let out a low whistle. Didn't think she'd gone that far. She kept the paperwork vague enough that the county didn't flag it until now. But we're correcting it all. You'll probably get a formal notice about new access markers. We won't touch anything without your written sign-off. I nodded. Appreciate that. He looked toward the shed. That the one she tore down? What's left of it, I said. Built the new one with reinforced beams. just in case anyone else gets ideas. Eric gave a short laugh, then climbed back into his truck. I helped him guide it out of the ditch with a length of tow cable and my old John Deere. As the engine roared back to life, he leaned out the window. Counties pressing additional charges. Misuse of public infrastructure. She diverted an emergency drainage channel to make room for a community garden that never existed. I stepped back as the truck rolled away. Of course she did. Back at the house, I found a certified envelope on the porch, not from the county, not from the court, but from a private law firm in Austin. Inside was a letter printed on thick, embossed paper. Dear Mr. Sawyer, we represent the interests of several former HOA board members who were unaware of the extent of Ms. Goldwyn's actions and wish to clarify their positions in the ongoing investigation. I didn't read the rest. They were trying to distance themselves now that the walls had caved in. I tossed it into the burn barrel next to the firewood stack. If they wanted to clear their names, they could do it in the courtroom like everyone else. The next few days passed quietly. The ranch returned to its usual rhythm, cattle feeding at dawn, tools clanking in the workshop, the wind rattling the porch screen. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. The district attorney's office began issuing subpoenas to contractors Clarissa had paid through her shell company. A landscaping firm in Tyler admitted they'd received nearly $30,000 in land beautification fees for work that had never left the invoice stage. A former accountant came forward with a flash drive full of emails showing Clarissa had ordered line item splits to disguise personal purchases, jewelry, hotel stays, and a down payment on a vacation property in Colorado. The state added 3 more felony counts to her record. But the worst came a week later when a forensic IT team discovered something buried in the HOA's old website server, a concealed admin login to a private spreadsheet labeled Compliance Watch. It listed names, addresses, and detailed notes on over 50 residents, including surveillance logs, gate codes, and vehicle models. Some entries had timestamps from late at night. Others included photos. When the news broke, it shook the entire county. This wasn't just about property lines, Raylene said when she called me. She was cataloging people, tracking them. She even had a list coded non-compliant with red asterisks next to certain names. Yours was on it. I gripped the phone tighter. She was building a blacklist. More like a hit list for harassment. She prioritized fines and inspections based on who she thought would resist her authority. That's criminal stalking, Dalton. We're reopening the case under new statutes. I stared out at the pasture, the fence posts casting long shadows in the evening light. What kind of person does that to their neighbors? She didn't see them as neighbors. She saw them as subjects. A grand jury indicted her on 14 counts. The stalking charge alone carried a possible sentence of 10 years. The judge ordered a psychological evaluation, but the results came back clear. She knew exactly what she was doing. The final court date arrived on a rainy Thursday. The courthouse was packed. Not just residents from the old HOA, but folks from every nearby town, people who'd heard what happened and wanted to witness the conclusion. Clarissa sat at the defense table, wrists shackled, her face pale and drawn. Gone was the sharp makeup, the designer blazer, the posture of someone who believed the rules bent to her will. In their place was a woman unraveling under the weight of her own lies. The judge reviewed the charges slowly, methodically. Fraud. Trespassing, destruction of property, racketeering, embezzlement, stalking. When asked if she had anything to say, Clarissa stood barely and said only this: I thought I was helping the community. The courtroom fell silent. Then the judge replied, you helped no one but yourself. And you did so by violating every trust placed in you. She was sentenced to 23 years in state prison with a mandatory minimum of 15 before parole eligibility. Restitution was ordered in the amount of $176,000 to be paid to the residents she defrauded. After the gavel dropped, people turned to me. Some nodded. A few shook my hand. But most just looked relieved, like a storm had finally passed and the air was clear again. Outside, Rick from the corner lot approached. His wife walked beside him, holding a baby I hadn't seen before. We named her Hope, he said, because after all that mess, we needed some. I smiled, something quiet and genuine. She's got a good name. They stayed a few minutes, then left. I lingered by the courthouse steps. Rain tapped against my hat brim. The wind smelled of cedar and clean soil. A kind of peace settled over me, not loud or triumphant, just steady. Back at the ranch, I finished restoring the last piece of the shed. The door latch, ripped off during the original vandalism, had been sitting on my workbench for months. I lined it up, drilled it in, and tested the swing. Smooth. Secure. I didn't frame the court documents. I didn't keep the newspaper clippings. I didn't need reminders. The land spoke for itself. And Clarissa Goldwyn? She could spend the next 2 decades thinking about how she tried to steal something that was never hers to begin with, and how a man with nothing but a deed, a camera, and the truth brought the whole thing crashing down.